Story 1.
My name is Ben, and I've been a farmer all my life, rooted deeply in the heart of Texas. The ranch where I've spent every waking moment is surrounded by endless fields and barren land, with nothing on the horizon but faint lines of trees and rolling hills. This place has been home to my family for generations, but lately, I'm not sure I can stay here any longer. It all began a few months ago when my livestock started disappearing without a trace. I initially blamed coyotes or other wild animals for the loss, but then things took a turn for the bizarre. At first, it was just strange noises, whispers that drifted through the fields when the wind died down. I started noticing dark shapes in the distance, but whenever I approached, there was nothing there. One night, while I was sitting on the porch staring at the stars, I saw something moving far out in the field. Grabbing my flashlight and rifle, I went to investigate. What I saw made my heart stop, a figure of a man standing in the field. As I got closer, he simply vanished, as if he dissolved into the air. Since then, I haven't been able to find any peace. Each night, strange apparitions began to appear around the ranch. They wandered aimlessly, staring at me with hollow eyes as though they were waiting for something. My livestock began to lose weight, and the land became barren, unsuitable for planting. I knew it wasn't just a coincidence, it was a curse. Desperate for answers, I delved into the history of our ranch and uncovered a dark past that had never been spoken of before. Apparently, there used to be a cemetery on this land, long since destroyed. Local legends spoke of horrific stories, but I had always dismissed them as mere fabrications. Now, as the nights grow darker and the wind carries with it the chilling breath of ghosts, I understand that these souls have returned to reclaim what was once theirs. I try to protect my ranch, but each day the struggle becomes more hopeless. I don't know how long I can keep resisting these ghosts, but one thing is clear. They will not leave me in peace. The presence of these spectral figures became more pronounced as time went on. They seemed to grow bolder, their apparitions more defined, often standing just outside my window or appearing at the edge of my fields. The once familiar landscape of my ranch had become a battleground between the living and the dead. The whispers grew louder and more coherent, speaking in a language I could almost understand but never fully grasp. They spoke of wrongs done, of lives taken, and of vengeance sought. Each night, I could hear the chilling echoes of their anger and pain, growing more desperate as if the ghosts were trying to communicate something crucial. My nights became a constant cycle of terror and vigilance. I fortified my home, setting up barriers and making sure every window and door was secure. I tried everything to protect myself and my land, but it felt like no matter what I did, the ghosts were always one step ahead, their presence growing more intrusive with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the ranch, I saw something that chilled me to my core. I was out by the barn, trying to calm my restless animals, when I noticed a flicker of light in the distance. It was a lantern, held by a spectral figure moving slowly through the field. The sight was enough to paralyze me with fear. With trembling hands, I grabbed my rifle and approached the figure, only to find that it vanished as I drew near. I stood in the cold, empty field, feeling a deep sense of dread settle over me. The night air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry grass. The next day, I found more of my livestock missing. It was as if the ghosts were not just haunting me but actively seeking to destroy everything I held dear. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if I was merely imagining these horrors or if there was truly something malevolent at work. Desperation led me to seek help from local historians and paranormal experts, hoping to uncover more about the cemetery that once stood on my land. Their findings were disturbing. Tales of sacrifices and dark rituals performed to ensure the land's fertility. The more I learned, the clearer it became that the ghosts were tied to these ancient practices. I began to understand the nature of the curse that had been placed upon my ranch. The spirits of those who had been wronged were trapped here, seeking to balance the scales of justice. They were angry and vengeful, and their presence grew stronger with every attempt I made to confront them. The nights became unbearable. Every creak of the house and gust of wind felt like a personal assault. I started seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and the whispers became almost deafening. My sleep was fitful and filled with nightmarish visions of the past, of people suffering and pleading for release. In my desperation, I tried to contact the spirits directly, hoping to communicate with them and find a way to lift the curse. I set up a makeshift seance in the middle of my barn, using old records and books that spoke of rituals and spiritual communication. The process was draining and eerie, filled with flickering candlelight and the crackling of the fire. During one of these sessions, I felt an overwhelming presence in the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the candles flickered wildly. I heard the unmistakable sound of a voice, clear and sorrowful, begging for release. The spirit's plea was heart-wrenching, filled with a deep sadness that resonated through my very soul. Despite my efforts, nothing changed. The ghosts continued to haunt me, their presence growing more oppressive and relentless. It seemed that no matter how hard I tried, the curse was inescapable, and the spirits would not find peace until their grievances were addressed. As the months passed, the situation grew dire. The ranch, once vibrant and full of life, had become a desolate wasteland. The fields were barren, and the animals that remained were gaunt and sickly. The land itself seemed to be withering under the weight of the curse, and I was at my wits' end. The local townsfolk began to avoid my ranch, fearful of the dark tales that surrounded it. I found myself increasingly isolated, with only the ghosts for company. The weight of the curse bore heavily on me, and I could feel my own sanity slipping away with each passing day. One night, as I wandered through the abandoned fields, I saw a sight that I had never seen before. The ground seemed to ripple and shift, and ghostly figures rose from the earth, their faces twisted in torment. They moved toward me, their hollow eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. In a last-ditch effort to rid myself of the curse, I consulted with an old shaman who was reputed to have experience with dealing with such malevolent forces. He came to my ranch, bringing with him an array of rituals and protective charms. His presence offered a glimmer of hope amidst the despair that had consumed me. The shaman conducted a series of elaborate ceremonies, chanting in an ancient language and placing protective symbols around the property. As he worked, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, as if the ghosts were momentarily stilled by his actions. But the respite was short-lived. Despite his efforts, the curse remained. The ghosts resumed their haunting, their presence growing more aggressive and intrusive. I felt as though every action I took to combat the curse only seemed to provoke the spirits further. With each passing day, the ghosts became bolder, their appearances more frequent and their actions more aggressive. My once peaceful ranch had turned into a battleground of supernatural forces, and I was caught in the middle of an ancient vendetta. I started experiencing vivid and horrifying visions in my dreams. I saw the faces of the dead, their expressions filled with rage and pain. They reached out to me, their ghostly hands grasping for something I could not understand. These dreams left me shaken and disoriented, further eroding my sense of reality. The curse seemed to have a life of its own, growing stronger and more insidious with each passing day. The land itself felt alive with malevolent energy, and the once familiar landscape of my ranch had become a nightmarish labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The isolation began to take its toll on me. I felt as though I was being slowly consumed by the curse, and every attempt to fight it only seemed to deepen my despair. My family, who had once shared this land with me, was now gone, leaving me to face this torment alone. The ghosts grew more brazen, appearing not only at night but during the day as well. Their presence was a constant reminder of the curse that had befallen my ranch. The whispers grew louder, and the apparitions more distinct, as if the spirits were trying to communicate something that I could not decipher. In my darkest moments, I found myself questioning my own sanity. The line between reality and the supernatural began to blur, and I felt as though I was losing my grip on what was real. The weight of the curse was unbearable, and I wondered if there was any escape from the torment that had engulfed my life. One evening, I stumbled upon an old diary buried in the attic of my farmhouse. It belonged to one of my ancestors, and its pages were filled with disturbing accounts of the cemetery and the rituals performed there. The diary spoke of a powerful curse that had been placed on the land, intended to ensure that the spirits of the wronged would never find peace. The more I read, the clearer it became that my family had been complicit in these dark practices. The diary detailed the methods used to summon and control the spirits, and it became evident that my ancestors had made a grave mistake. The curse they had unleashed was now consuming me and my land. Desperate for answers, I sought out the descendants of those who had originally been wronged. I hoped that by addressing their grievances, I might be able to lift the curse. But finding these individuals proved to be nearly impossible, as many had disappeared or moved far away. In a final act of desperation, I decided to confront the spirits directly. Armed with the knowledge from the diary, I performed a ritual intended to appease the restless souls and seek their forgiveness. I gathered the necessary ingredients and set up a makeshift altar in the heart of the ranch, hoping that this would bring an end to the haunting. The ritual was intense and emotionally draining. As I chanted the ancient words and performed the prescribed actions, I felt a profound sense of sorrow and remorse. The ghosts seemed to respond, their presence growing more intense and their whispers more urgent. Despite my efforts, the ritual did not bring the resolution I had hoped for. The ghosts continued to haunt me, their anger and despair unabated. It became clear that the curse was far more powerful than I had anticipated, and my attempts to break it were in vain. As the curse persisted, I began to notice a change in the behavior of the ghosts. They seemed to become more aggressive and violent, their actions growing increasingly erratic. The once subtle whispers turned into frantic cries and howls, echoing through the fields and the farmhouse. The apparitions appeared more frequently, often in the form of distorted and grotesque figures. Their presence was accompanied by a palpable sense of malevolence, and it felt as though the very air around me was charged with dark energy. The ranch had become a place of constant fear and anxiety. I tried to protect myself with every means at my disposal, from physical barriers to spiritual safeguards. But nothing seemed to make a difference. The ghosts continued their relentless assault, and I was left feeling helpless and trapped in a nightmarish reality that I could not escape. My attempts to leave the ranch were thwarted by an overwhelming sense of dread and foreboding. Every time I tried to pack my belongings and seek refuge elsewhere, I was overcome by a powerful, inexplicable force that prevented me from leaving. It was as though the ranch itself was holding me captive, unwilling to let me escape its cursed grasp. The isolation and constant fear began to wear me down. I felt as though I was living in a state of perpetual terror, with the ghosts encroaching on every aspect of my life. My once proud ranch had become a prison, and I was its unwilling inmate. In my darkest moments, I considered ending it all, hoping to escape the torment that had become my reality. But the thought of what the ghosts might do to me in death kept me from taking that final step. I was trapped in a hell of my own making, with no apparent way out. As the curse continued to ravage my life, I began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of the land itself. The soil became more barren, and the plants that managed to grow were twisted and deformed. The once fertile fields were now nothing more than a wasteland of dead vegetation and cracked earth. The animals that remained were increasingly agitated and unpredictable. They would often lash out violently, as though possessed by the same malevolent forces that plagued me. The once peaceful ranch had turned into a place of constant chaos and fear. In my desperation, I began to scour the land for any signs of hidden knowledge or forgotten rituals that might offer a solution to my plight. I unearthed old artifacts and examined them for clues, hoping that something would reveal a way to break the curse. One day, while exploring a particularly desolate part of the ranch, I stumbled upon an old, hidden burial ground. The graves were marked with crude, weathered stones, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of foreboding. It was clear that this was the remains of the long-forgotten cemetery mentioned in the diary. The discovery was both a blessing and a curse. It provided me with a tangible link to the past and a potential source of answers, but it also deepened my sense of dread. The presence of the burial ground confirmed that the curse was rooted in ancient wrongs, and it was clear that the spirits would not be easily appeased. I began to dig through the graves, hoping to uncover any remnants of the rituals performed there. The work was grueling and disturbing, but I was determined to find a way to end the curse and free myself from the torment that had consumed my life. As I continued to excavate the burial ground, I unearthed a series of strange artifacts and symbols. Some of them appeared to be remnants of the rituals performed by my ancestors, while others seemed to be related to the local legends and folklore surrounding the area. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the curse was a complex and deeply rooted problem. The artifacts hinted at a series of dark rituals intended to bind the spirits to the land, ensuring that they would never find peace. The realization was both horrifying and enlightening. I began to piece together the information, hoping to find a way to counteract the dark magic that had been used to create the curse. The process was slow and painstaking, but I was determined to break the cycle of torment and find a way to restore peace to my ranch. In my research, I discovered that the only way to break the curse was to perform a counter-ritual that would release the trapped spirits and restore balance to the land. The ritual required a series of specific actions and incantations, as well as the use of certain artifacts and symbols that I had uncovered. I prepared for the ritual with a mix of hope and trepidation. The process was arduous and filled with uncertainty, but I knew that it was my last chance to free myself from the curse. I set up the necessary components and began the ritual, hoping that it would bring an end to the haunting that had plagued me for so long. As I performed the ritual, I felt a strange sense of calm and resolve. The spirits seemed to respond to the counter-ritual, their presence growing less oppressive and their whispers fading into the background. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and the land began to feel less hostile and more serene. Despite my efforts, the final outcome of the ritual remained uncertain. The ghosts appeared to be quieter and less aggressive, but I could not shake the feeling that the curse was still lingering. The ranch seemed to be in a state of uneasy truce, with the spirits remaining dormant but not completely vanquished. I continued to monitor the land and the animals, hoping that the peace would hold and that the curse had finally been broken. The once terrifying presence of the ghosts had diminished, but the memory of their torment still haunted me. The process of healing the land and restoring it to its former state was slow and difficult. The fields remained barren, and the animals were still recovering from the effects of the curse. It became clear that the damage inflicted by the curse would take time to repair. As time went on, the ranch began to show signs of recovery. The fields slowly started to regain their fertility, and the animals showed signs of improved health. The ghosts, though still present in some form, were no longer as aggressive or intrusive as they had been. I found some solace in the fact that the worst of the haunting seemed to be over, but the experience had left its mark on me. The terror and isolation I had endured were not easily forgotten, and I was left with a profound sense of loss and sorrow. The ranch, once a symbol of my family's legacy, had become a reminder of the dark forces that had lurked beneath its surface. Though the curse had been lifted, the memory of the ghosts and the suffering they had caused would remain with me forever.
Story 2.
My name is Jake, and I am a farmer. My life had always been simple and quiet until the day evil came to my ranch. I live in a small house on the outskirts of a town, where our fields stretch across the countryside. Each day, I toil away in the fields, and I always thought of night as a time for rest. But recently, night has become a place where nothing happens but terror. Last summer, I noticed something strange happening with my crops. They had always grown well before, but now, every morning, I would find a part of the field where the plants had withered and turned to dust. I tried to find the cause but couldn't figure out what was happening. My neighbors complained about similar issues with their fields, but no one could explain it. One night, as I was trying to finish up on the field, I suddenly felt the ground beneath my feet begin to tremble. I looked up and saw a dark cloud slowly covering my fields. With each step, the darkness grew thicker, as if it were swallowing all the light around me. I hurried back to the house, but fear had already taken root in my mind. Night after night, the darkness continued to expand. I saw dark figures roaming among the crops in the fields. They merged with the shadows and disappeared when I approached. My livestock began to behave strangely. Herds grew restless and often made unsettling noises. I knew it wasn't just my imagination when I found bloody tracks leading to an old cemetery at the edge of my ranch. Investigating the history revealed that there had once been an ancient cemetery on this land, which had been demolished to expand the farmlands. They say that the spirits of the deceased always remain where their remains lie, and now they have returned to seek revenge for their violent removal. I tried to save my ranch from this darkness, but with each passing day, the situation worsened. The figures in the fields became more distinct, their forms growing more grotesque and menacing. My dreams were filled with visions of the cemetery, and I began to question my own sanity. The more I tried to understand what was happening, the more elusive the answers became. I consulted local historians and even a priest, but none had any real solutions. The priest performed a blessing, but the darkness remained, and the hauntings only seemed to intensify. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed my crops were not just withering, they were being consumed by an invisible force. The land seemed to be starving, and no matter how much water and care I provided, nothing would grow. The fields, once lush and green, were now barren and lifeless. My wife, Emily, grew increasingly worried about the strange occurrences and my growing obsession with the fields. She tried to comfort me, but I was too far gone, consumed by the fear and desperation to save our land. Our once happy home became a place of tension and unease. One evening, as I worked late into the night, I saw the dark figures again, this time more clearly. They were shadowy forms with glowing eyes, moving with an unnatural grace. They seemed to be watching me, waiting for something. The terror I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Emily's health began to deteriorate, and I couldn't help but blame myself. The stress of the situation seemed to take a toll on her. She complained of nightmares and strange sensations at night. I couldn't protect her from the growing evil that seemed to have taken over our lives. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the cemetery, hoping to find some clue that could help me understand the spirit's unrest. What I discovered was even more horrifying. The cemetery had been the site of a series of brutal and unexplained deaths. The spirits were restless and seeking justice. One night, the darkness reached its peak. The sky above the ranch turned an unnatural shade of red, and a storm raged with lightning that seemed to strike only the fields. The figures became more aggressive, and their presence was overwhelming. I knew then that the situation was beyond my control. Desperate for a solution, I began to experiment with old rituals and practices that I had read about. I hoped to appease the spirits or banish them, but each attempt seemed to only make things worse. The darkness seemed to mock my efforts, growing stronger and more malevolent. As the season changed, so did the intensity of the hauntings. The once quiet nights were now filled with sounds of unseen forces wreaking havoc. I could no longer tell where reality ended and the supernatural began. The ranch that once symbolized my hard work and dedication now stood as a monument to my failure and fear. In a final attempt to reclaim my life, I sought the help of a renowned paranormal investigator. He arrived with an array of equipment and a confident demeanor, but even he seemed unnerved by the darkness that enveloped the ranch. His attempts to communicate with the spirits only seemed to draw them closer. the investigator uncovered disturbing details about the cemetery's past. It wasn't just the destruction of the site that angered the spirits, it was the desecration of their graves. The bodies had been moved in a haphazard and disrespectful manner, fueling their rage and thirst for vengeance. As the investigator conducted his work, he was struck by a series of inexplicable events. Objects flew through the air, and strange noises filled the air. The tension reached a breaking point, and he warned me that the spirits were growing increasingly hostile. The investigator's departure left me more desolate than before. Without his expertise, I felt even more powerless against the forces that haunted my land. My isolation grew, and the once familiar comfort of home now felt like a prison. Emily's condition worsened, and I knew that the source of her suffering was connected to the evil that had taken root on our ranch. Her nightmares became more violent, and she started to speak of seeing things that weren't there. The darkness seemed to be reaching out to her directly. I began to notice a pattern in the hauntings. Each night brought new and more terrifying experiences. The dark figures appeared more frequently, and their actions became increasingly aggressive. They seemed to be trying to drive me to the brink of madness. The once vibrant community around me began to distance themselves. The stories of my cursed ranch spread, and I found myself increasingly isolated. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided me, their fearful glances a constant reminder of my plight. Desperation led me to seek out ancient texts and rituals that promised to banish spirits and restore peace. I spent countless nights performing these rituals, hoping to break the cycle of terror. Each attempt ended in failure, with the darkness growing ever stronger. One night, I discovered an old journal hidden in the attic of my house. It belonged to the original owner of the land and detailed the history of the cemetery and its desecration. The journal spoke of a powerful curse placed upon the land, which had been triggered by the destruction of the graves. The journal's revelations provided a glimmer of hope. If the curse could be undone, perhaps the spirits would be appeased, and the darkness would recede. I set out to follow the instructions detailed in the journal, hoping it would be my salvation. The rituals described in the journal were complex and required rare ingredients and precise timing. I gathered everything I needed and performed the rituals with the hope that this would finally put an end to the torment that had plagued my life. As I conducted the final ritual, the intensity of the haunting reached its peak. The dark figures surrounded me, their malevolent presence almost suffocating. I felt a cold, unnatural wind sweep through the fields, and the ground beneath me seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The ritual seemed to have some effect, as the darkness temporarily receded. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief and hope. However, the respite was short-lived, and the darkness quickly returned, stronger and more relentless than before. I continued to battle the darkness, but my strength was waning. The toll on my physical and mental health was severe. I could no longer distinguish between reality and the horrors that plagued my mind. The ranch, once a symbol of my hard work, had become a place of despair. My final attempt to save my ranch involved a last-ditch effort to contact a powerful medium who specialized in dealing with vengeful spirits. The medium arrived with an air of authority, but even she seemed wary of the dark forces at play. Her efforts to communicate with the spirits only added to the growing sense of dread. The medium's presence brought a temporary calm, but it was quickly overshadowed by the intensifying hauntings. She conducted a seance to communicate with the spirits, hoping to understand their grievances and find a way to resolve the curse. During the seance, the spirits communicated their anger and frustration. They spoke of the pain and disrespect they had suffered, and their desire for justice. Their messages were chilling and revealed the depth of their suffering. The medium attempted to negotiate with the spirits, promising to make amends for the past transgressions. She performed rituals to honor the dead and seek their forgiveness. However, the spirits remained restless, and the darkness continued to loom over the ranch. My sense of isolation grew as the spirit's presence became more pronounced. The dark figures seemed to follow me wherever I went, and the once familiar surroundings of my ranch became a maze of terror and confusion. The fields, now barren and lifeless, stood as a testament to my failure. Emily's condition deteriorated further, and her nightmares became more vivid and horrifying. She spoke of strange visions and voices that tormented her, and I could see the fear and anguish in her eyes. The darkness that had taken over the ranch had begun to consume her as well. I reached out to local authorities and historians, hoping that their expertise might provide a solution. However, their skepticism and lack of understanding only added to my sense of helplessness. They dismissed my concerns as mere superstition, leaving me to face the darkness alone. As the nights grew longer, the darkness seemed to spread beyond the boundaries of my ranch. The entire area was affected, with other farmers and townspeople reporting similar experiences of eerie phenomena and unexplained occurrences. The curse appeared to be expanding. I tried to find solace in memories of better times, but they were overshadowed by the relentless terror of the present. My once peaceful life had been turned into a nightmare, and the hope of reclaiming my ranch seemed increasingly distant. Desperation led me to take extreme measures. I attempted to leave the ranch, hoping that distance might provide relief from the haunting presence. However, every time I tried to escape, I found myself drawn back to the ranch, as if some unseen force were preventing me from leaving. The darkness became more aggressive, manifesting in violent and disturbing ways. Objects in the house moved on their own, and strange noises filled the air. The once comforting environment of my home had become a place of terror and despair. In a final act of defiance, I confronted the spirits directly. I pleaded with them for forgiveness and sought to understand their demands. The encounter was intense and harrowing, with the spirits expressing their anger and frustration in a way that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The confrontation seemed to have a temporary effect, as the darkness receded once again. I hoped that this time, the spirits had been appeased, but the relief was fleeting. The darkness quickly returned, stronger and more relentless than before. My efforts to save the ranch became a desperate and losing battle. The darkness had claimed every corner of my life, leaving me isolated and broken. The fields, once a source of pride, were now a symbol of my failure to protect what I held dear. The final stages of the haunting were marked by a profound sense of hopelessness. The darkness enveloped everything, and I felt as though I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. My attempts to fight back were met with increasing resistance and malevolence. In the end, I realized that there was no escaping the darkness that had taken over my life. My once peaceful ranch had become a place of unending terror, and the spirit's wrath seemed insurmountable. The hope of reclaiming my life and my land faded, leaving me with nothing but despair. As the darkness continued to engulf every aspect of my life, I began to accept the inevitable. The ranch that once symbolized my hard work and dedication had become a place of despair and terror. My attempts to fight the darkness were futile, and I felt completely powerless. The final confrontation with the spirits left me with a deep sense of resignation. I had done everything within my power to appease them and restore peace, but nothing seemed to work. The darkness remained a constant presence, and I could no longer distinguish between reality and the supernatural. Emily's condition deteriorated to the point where she could no longer distinguish between waking life and nightmares. Her health continued to decline, and I watched helplessly as the darkness consumed her mind and body. The once vibrant woman I had loved was now a shell of her former self. The isolation of the ranch grew more pronounced as the community distanced themselves from us. My pleas for help went unanswered, and the growing reputation of my cursed land only fueled the fear and distrust of those around me. I was left to face the darkness alone. The final days on the ranch were marked by a profound sense of hopelessness. The darkness had taken over every aspect of my life, and I felt as though I was trapped in an unending nightmare. My efforts to save my land and my family had been in vain. The fields, once a symbol of my hard work, were now a barren wasteland. The crops that had once thrived were reduced to dust, and the land seemed to be cursed beyond redemption. The darkness that had consumed my fields had also consumed my spirit. My final moments on the ranch were spent in a state of resignation. I knew that there was no escaping the darkness that had taken over my life. The hope of reclaiming my land and my sanity had faded, leaving me with only despair and defeat. The spirit's wrath seemed insurmountable, and their presence continued to haunt every corner of my existence. My attempts to find peace and resolution were met with increasing resistance, and the darkness remained an unrelenting force. As I prepared to leave the ranch for the final time, I felt a profound sense of loss. The land that had once been a source of pride and fulfillment had become a place of unending terror. My life had been forever altered by the evil that had taken root. The final chapter of my story was marked by a deep sense of sorrow and regret. The darkness that had consumed my ranch had also consumed my life, leaving me with nothing but memories of what once was. The hope of redemption had been lost. As I looked back on my life, I realized that the darkness had changed me in ways I could never fully understand. The terror and despair had left an indelible mark on my soul, and the once peaceful life I had known was now a distant memory. The curse that had claimed my land and my sanity seemed to have no end. The darkness continued to linger, a constant reminder of the evil that had taken over my life. My attempts to escape were in vain, and the haunting presence remained a part of my existence. In the end, I accepted the reality of my situation. The darkness had claimed everything that was once dear to me, leaving me with nothing but a profound sense of loss and despair. My story had become one of tragedy and sorrow. The final days on the ranch were marked by a deep sense of resignation. I knew that there was no escaping the darkness that had taken over my life, and the hope of reclaiming my land and my sanity had faded into nothingness. As I left the ranch for the last time, I carried with me the weight of my experiences and the memories of a life forever altered by the forces of evil. The darkness had claimed my land, my family, and my sanity, leaving me with nothing but the haunting memories of a once peaceful existence.
Story 3.
My name is Tom, and I'm a farmer living on Chestnut Ranch. This place has always been serene and remote, and I cherished every moment of my work. My fields and animals were my life, my pride, and my joy. But everything changed a few months ago when rumors of a witch began circulating in our county. What started as whispers soon took on a life of their own, spreading through the townsfolk like wildfire. The rumors began circulating after my crops started to wither away for no apparent reason. Initially, I thought it was just a result of bad weather or plant diseases. It was a cruel twist of fate that my once thriving fields were now turning into barren wastelands. My attempts to revive them seemed pointless, and soon, other farmers reported similar problems. The land, which had always yielded bountiful harvests, was now failing us all. As time went on, I noticed something even more unsettling. My animals began to act erratically at night. They would pace restlessly in their pens, making strange, distressing noises. The eerie sounds that emanated from the darkened forest surrounding my ranch grew more frequent and disturbing. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with a sinister presence that tormented the animals and unsettled me to my core. One night, unable to endure the growing sense of dread any longer, I decided to investigate the source of these unsettling noises. I stepped outside into the chilling night air and was struck by an unexpected sight, a strange, flickering light glowing softly among the trees. This light was unlike anything I had ever seen, both captivating and disconcerting. It seemed to call out to me, drawing me deeper into the darkness of the forest. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I followed the light through the forest. The path was obscured by thick underbrush, and the branches of the trees reached out like skeletal hands. As I ventured deeper, the light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced on the ground. Eventually, it led me to an old, dilapidated cabin that I had never noticed before. The cabin appeared as though it had been abandoned for decades, its wooden walls weathered and cracked, hidden away in the heart of the forest. The moment I stepped inside the cabin, a cold, musty draft greeted me, and the air felt heavy with neglect. It was as if time had stopped within those walls. I turned on my flashlight, and its beam illuminated the interior, revealing a scene frozen in decay. Old, forgotten objects were strewn haphazardly about, covered in layers of dust. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and cryptic markings, their meaning unknown and unsettling. As I explored the cabin, my flashlight fell upon a weathered book lying on a dusty table. Its cover was adorned with bizarre symbols that matched those on the walls. Trembling with apprehension, I opened the book to find pages filled with incantations and spells, written in a language I didn't recognize. The air seemed to grow colder as I read, and an oppressive silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. That night marked the beginning of a series of inexplicable events. When I returned home, I found my animals in even worse condition, their eyes wide with fear and their behavior increasingly erratic. The fields that had once been my pride now lay fallow, and the once healthy crops were nothing more than withered husks. The nightmarish sounds continued to plague the darkness, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to seep into every corner of my life. The following days brought no relief. The strange occurrences only intensified. I saw ghostly figures darting between the trees, and the animals' distress grew more pronounced. It was clear that something malevolent had taken hold of the land. The unsettling presence that had emerged from the forest seemed to be spreading its influence over my ranch, feeding off the fear and despair that had begun to permeate my once peaceful life. Desperate for answers, I sought out the local elders and wise folk, hoping they might shed some light on the situation. They spoke in hushed tones of a witch who had once lived on this land. Her name was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence. According to their tales, she had been accused of dark practices and cast out, but her spirit was said to linger, seeking revenge for her unjust demise. The more I learned about this witch, the more I realized that the dark forces affecting my ranch were not just figments of my imagination. The stories painted a picture of a powerful and vengeful spirit that had been wronged and was now unleashing its wrath upon those who dared to tread upon its former domain. It became clear that the witch's curse was not only real but had come to claim my ranch as its own. The knowledge that I was dealing with a malevolent spirit only added to my sense of dread. Every night, I would hear the eerie whispers of the forest and the restless cries of my animals. The once familiar land had transformed into a realm of fear and darkness. The oppressive weight of the curse seemed to press down on me, making each day a struggle to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Despite my efforts to combat the encroaching darkness, the situation continued to worsen. My fields remained barren, and the strange phenomena showed no signs of abating. The witch's influence seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was as if the very land itself was being consumed by the malevolent force that had taken root. I tried various remedies and sought help from experts, but nothing seemed to alleviate the curse. The more I struggled, the more I felt like I was losing control of my own life. The witch's curse had not only ravaged my fields but had also begun to invade my mind, leaving me in a constant state of fear and helplessness. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself increasingly isolated. The once bustling ranch had become a place of sorrow and despair. The rumors of the witch and the mounting evidence of her curse had driven away anyone who might have offered support. Now, it felt like I was facing this darkness alone, with only the shadows of the forest as my companions. With each passing night, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. The dark presence seemed to wrap itself around my home and land, making even the simplest tasks feel like monumental challenges. The forest that once offered solace now loomed ominously, its shadows stretching ever closer to my doorstep. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the witch's influence made it increasingly difficult. The eerie light that had initially drawn me to the cabin now seemed to cast a malevolent glow over everything I did. The more I fought against it, the more entrenched it became in my life. Desperate for a solution, I returned to the cabin in the forest, hoping to find something that might help me lift the curse. The old book with its incantations and spells was my only clue. I began to study it in greater detail, searching for any hint that might lead me to a way to break the curse. Each night, as I pored over the ancient text, I could feel the weight of the witch's presence growing heavier. The book was filled with complex rituals and arcane symbols that were beyond my understanding. I tried performing some of the rituals, hoping to appease the spirit or drive it away, but each attempt seemed to only make things worse. The more I delved into the book, the more the darkness seemed to resist my efforts. As I continued my attempts to lift the curse, the forest around my ranch grew even more foreboding. The once familiar paths became treacherous, and the sounds of the forest grew more menacing. I began to notice strange, unnatural occurrences, trees that seemed to move and shift, and shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The locals had long warned me about the witch's curse, but I had always dismissed their warnings as superstitions. Now, I found myself facing the very thing they had warned me about. The curse was real, and its effects were far worse than I could have ever imagined. My once thriving ranch had become a place of dread and despair. The witch's influence seemed to reach into every corner of my life, distorting reality and making it difficult to discern what was real and what was merely a product of my fear. The boundaries between the physical world and the supernatural seemed to blur, leaving me feeling trapped in a nightmarish realm where nothing made sense. Each day brought new challenges as the curse continued to ravage my ranch. My crops remained barren, and the animals' behavior grew more erratic. The once thriving fields were now empty wastelands, and the eerie noises from the forest seemed to grow louder and more unsettling with each passing day. Despite my efforts to fight the darkness, it seemed to be winning. The witch's curse had taken hold of my life, and I felt increasingly powerless to stop it. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, and I began to question whether there was any way to escape the malevolent forces that had ensnared me. My isolation deepened as the witch's curse continued to drive away those who might have offered help. The once bustling community had turned its back on me, leaving me to face the darkness alone. The burden of the curse seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, and my sense of despair became all-consuming. In my darkest moments, I wondered if there was any hope left. The once familiar land had become a place of nightmares, and the curse seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of my existence. The sense of dread and hopelessness was overwhelming, and I found it difficult to hold on to even a sliver of hope. Despite the growing sense of despair, I refused to give up. I continued to search for answers, determined to find a way to break the curse and restore my ranch to its former glory. The witch's presence was a constant reminder of the battle I was fighting, and I knew that I had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. The struggle against the witch's curse had become a battle of wills. Each day felt like a test of my resolve, and the darkness seemed to grow stronger with every attempt I made to combat it. The once familiar landscape had become a battleground, and I felt like a lone warrior fighting against an unstoppable force. The witch's influence seemed to seep into every aspect of my life, distorting my perceptions and making it difficult to discern reality from illusion. The boundaries between the physical world and the supernatural had become increasingly blurred, leaving me feeling lost and disoriented. Despite the overwhelming odds, I remained determined to fight. The darkness that had taken hold of my ranch was a constant reminder of what I had lost, and I refused to let it define my life. The struggle against the witch's curse had become a part of me, and I knew that I had to keep fighting, no matter how dire the situation seemed. As the witch's curse continued to ravage my ranch, I found myself increasingly isolated from the world. The once thriving community had turned its back on me, and I was left to face the darkness alone. The burden of the curse was overwhelming, and I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The forest surrounding my ranch had become a place of constant dread. The once familiar paths were now twisted and treacherous, and the eerie sounds that emanated from the trees seemed to grow louder and more menacing. It was as if the forest itself had become an extension of the witch's malevolent influence. Despite my best efforts, the curse seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. My attempts to lift it had only seemed to make things worse, and the darkness that had taken hold of my ranch seemed to be spreading. The fields remained barren, and the animals' behavior grew more erratic. The sense of hopelessness was overwhelming, and I found it difficult to hold on to even a sliver of hope. The once familiar land had become a place of nightmares, and the witch's presence was a constant reminder of my struggle. Each day felt like a battle, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. In my darkest moments, I sought solace in the old book I had found in the cabin. Its pages were filled with ancient spells and rituals, and I hoped that they might hold the key to breaking the curse. I pored over the text, searching for any hint of a solution that might help me lift the darkness that had consumed my life. As I studied the book, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. The once twisted paths seemed to shift and change, and the eerie sounds that had plagued me grew quieter. It was as if the witch's influence was being countered by the rituals I was attempting, but the darkness was far from defeated. Despite the small victories, the sense of dread and despair remained. The witch's curse had taken a profound toll on my life, and the struggle to lift it felt like an insurmountable challenge. The darkness seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of my existence, and I found it difficult to escape its grip. The isolation and sense of hopelessness weighed heavily on me, and I began to question whether there was any way to break free from the curse. The once familiar landscape had become a place of fear and despair, and the witch's presence was a constant reminder of the battle I was fighting. The community that had once supported me was now a distant memory. The curse had driven everyone away, leaving me to face the darkness alone. The burden of the witch's malevolent influence was overwhelming, and I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Despite the overwhelming odds, I refused to give up. I continued to search for answers, determined to find a way to break the curse and restore my ranch to its former glory. The struggle against the witch's darkness had become a part of me, and I knew that I had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. Each day felt like a test of my resolve, and the darkness seemed to grow stronger with every attempt I made to combat it. The once familiar landscape had become a battleground, and I felt like a lone warrior fighting against an unstoppable force. The witch's influence seemed to seep into every aspect of my life, distorting reality and making it difficult to discern what was real and what was merely a product of my fear. The boundaries between the physical world and the supernatural had become increasingly blurred. Despite the growing sense of despair, I continued to search for a way to lift the curse. The old book held the promise of a solution, and I was determined to find it. Each night, I pored over the ancient text, hoping that I might discover a way to break the darkness that had consumed my life. The struggle against the curse had become a battle of wills. Each day felt like a test of my resolve, and the darkness seemed to grow stronger with every attempt I made to fight it. The witch's malevolent influence had taken hold of my ranch, and I was determined to reclaim it. The fight against the witch's curse had become a part of my life, and I refused to let it define me. Despite the overwhelming odds, I continued to battle the darkness, hoping that one day I might find a way to break free from its grip and restore my ranch to its former glory. As the struggle against the witch's curse continued, I found myself facing new and unexpected challenges. The forest around my ranch seemed to take on a life of its own, with trees shifting and paths becoming increasingly treacherous. The once familiar landscape had become a maze of fear and uncertainty. Despite the growing sense of dread, I remained determined to find a solution. The old book with its ancient spells and rituals remained my only hope. I pored over its pages each night, searching for any hint of a way to lift the curse that had taken hold of my life. The witch's influence seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, and the darkness that had consumed my ranch showed no signs of abating. My fields remained barren, and the animals' behavior continued to be erratic. The once thriving land had become a place of despair, and I felt increasingly isolated from the world. The eerie light that had first drawn me to the cabin in the forest continued to haunt my dreams. It was as if the light itself was a symbol of the darkness that had taken hold of my life. Each night, I would see it flickering in the distance, taunting me with the promise of answers that remained elusive. Despite my efforts, the curse seemed to resist all attempts to break it. The rituals I performed had little effect, and the darkness seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was as if the witch's malevolent spirit was feeding off my fear and despair, making the battle against it even more challenging. The isolation I felt was overwhelming, and the burden of the curse seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The once thriving community that had supported me was now a distant memory, and I was left to face the darkness alone. The struggle to lift the curse had become a battle of endurance, and I felt like I was running out of hope. The forest that had once provided solace now felt like a prison. The paths that I once knew so well had become twisted and dangerous, and the eerie sounds that emanated from the trees seemed to grow louder and more menacing. It was as if the forest itself had become a reflection of the witch's curse. Despite the growing sense of hopelessness, I refused to give up. I continued to search for answers, determined to find a way to break the curse and restore my ranch to its former glory. The old book remained my guide, and I hoped that its ancient wisdom might hold the key to lifting the darkness that had consumed my life. Each day felt like a test of my resolve, and the darkness seemed to grow stronger with every attempt I made to combat it. The once familiar landscape had become a battleground, and I felt like a lone warrior fighting against an unstoppable force. The witch's curse had taken hold of my life, and I was determined to reclaim it. The sense of isolation and despair continued to weigh heavily on me, and I struggled to hold on to even a sliver of hope. The witch's influence seemed to seep into every aspect of my life, distorting reality and making it difficult to discern what was real and what was merely a product of my fear. Despite the overwhelming odds, I remained determined to fight. The darkness that had taken hold of my ranch was a constant reminder of what I had lost, and I refused to let it define my life. The struggle against the witch's curse had become a part of me, and I knew that I had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed. The old book held the promise of a solution, and I clung to that hope with all my strength. Each night, I would study its pages, hoping to find a way to break the curse and restore my ranch to its former glory. The battle against the darkness had become a part of my life, and I was determined to see it through to the end. The struggle against the witch's curse had become a battle of wills, and each day felt like a test of my resolve. The darkness seemed to grow stronger with every attempt I made to fight it, and the once familiar landscape had become a battleground of fear and despair. Despite the growing sense of hopelessness, I refused to give up. The old book remained my guide, and I continued to search for answers, determined to find a way to lift the curse and restore my ranch to its former glory. The battle against the darkness was far from over, and I knew that I had to keep fighting, no matter how dire the situation seemed. The witch's curse had taken a profound toll on my life, and the struggle to lift it felt like an insurmountable challenge. The darkness seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of my existence, and I found it difficult to escape its grip. But despite the overwhelming odds, I continued to fight, clinging to the hope that one day I might find a way to break free from the curse and restore my life to its former glory.